Composing. There are various ways and stages of composing an essay. One might distinguish between preliminaries to writing the first draft, and writing successive drafts. Among the preliminaries to writing are selecting a topic and outlining your essay. Writing successive drafts include writing second and third drafts and polishing. Not all of these topics will be discussed in this chapter. You can find discussions of all of them in any number of general books on writing. Yet there is one point that I want to underscore. Writing must be done in stages. Do not expect to produce an essay of high quality if you write it straight through in one draft. Too many students think that they have a genius for writing. They are wrong. Fewer people than you think are geniuses, and even people with a genius for writing recognize the need for preparing to write and rewriting. Perhaps Thomas Edison was right. Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Too many students do not realize that writing is a kind of labor. After Adam sinned, God said to him, because you have listened to your wife and have eaten from the tree which I forbade you, ac- accursed shall be the ground on your account. With labor you shall win your food from it all the days of your life, and with labor you shall write your essays all the nights of your life. It is a tragic that some scribes, cosmically depressed by his fate, omitted the last two lines at some stage of transmitting the Bible as we know it. I have spoken at some length and with some harshness about the stages of composing an essay, because neglect of these stages is the single worst failing of student composition. Too often, students fail to prepare adequately before they begin their first draft and fail to revise. For most of the stages of composing, nothing needs to be added here, since most of the stages of philosophical composing are the same as those of other disciplines. However, there are some techniques of composing that students seem to have special problems with when they try to write philosophical essays, and there are some techniques that I have developed and are not discussed in other books. I will restrict my remarks to these topics. How to select an essay topic. The first thing to do before you begin writing your first draft is to select a topic. Your professor may have given you very specific topics from which to choose, or he may allow you to shape your own topic from a general one. Since this latter possibility is the more troublesome, I will assume that you are in that situation. Some general topics are the problem of universals, the nature of free will, the problem of determinism, the relationship between mind and body, Plato's theory of the good, Anselm's ontological argument, the meaning of Descartes' cogito ergo sum. It is virtually impossible to write a good essay if your topic is not more specific than these are. Notice that these topics are formulated as noun phrases. They do not commit the author of an essay to any particular position. For example, the first topic listed, the problem of universals, is neutral between belief that universals exist and the belief that they do not. Essay topics should not be neutral. The author of an essay must commit herself to some position which is either true or false. Of, of course, an author always tries to prove a thesis that she thinks is true, but whether her thesis is true or false, it must have a truth value. In order to ensure that your topic does express some thesis, formulate it as a declarative sentence. There are no universals, no humans have free will. Determinism is true, mind and body are identical. For our purpose, it is not important whether you argue that there are universals or that there are not. What is important is that you commit yourself to one position or another, for it will be that commitment around which your essay will develop. The topics listed above may be appropriate for essays in introductory classes in philosophy. In advanced classes in philosophy, they will be too broad. The more advanced the study of some topic is, the narrower the topics are. One reason for this is that in introductory classes, students know less and have less to say about topics, thus, the topics need to be broader. In advanced courses, students know more and have more to say about topics, thus, the topics can be narrower. People who complain that professional philosophy is too narrow do not realize that this is a sign of progress in philosophy. How many of them would complain about the narrowness of most scientific research projects? Techniques for composing. There are a number of techniques that you can use to begin the process of drafting your essay. Outlining your ideas, successive elaboration, conceptual note taking. None of these techniques is inherently better than any other. The best technique is the one that gets the essay written. Yes, written. If something is worth doing, it is worth doing badly. It goes without saying that writing a good essay is even better than writing a bad one. Which technique is best is relative to the author and to the occasion of her writing. Students write more or less on demand. Your assignment for Monday is to write a 1,000-word essay on the influence of Indian mysticism on Plotinus, doctrine of the descent of the soul. That's probably not a topic that you would have wanted to write about in the normal course of events. On some topics, your thought may be sufficiently well ordered to allow you to outline your ideas immediately. On other topics, you may know only that you want to defend a certain proposition and need to elaborate it in the course of successive drafts. On still other topics, you may have nothing more at the beginning than a number of elusive thoughts that need to be written down without being censored by your critical faculties. These techniques are not mutually exclusive. Two or even all three can be used in the composition of an essay, and two or all three might be used on some segments of the essay and not others. When several techniques are used, it is not important in what order they are used. Further, one technique can be used more than once. You can use a technique, then another, and then return to the first. Outlining serves the same purpose as the outline of the structure of a philosophical essay. In chapter 3, it makes the content of your essay clearer by making its structure clearer. During those initial efforts at composing, outlining can be as helpful for figuring out what you want to say as how you would say it. When I was an undergraduate, the culmination of History of English Literature, Beowulf to the Wasteland, a year-long course required of all sophomores, engineers, and business students included, was the submission of a research paper, 7,000 words. In addition to the paper itself, all the note cards one had accumulated in the process of research, all preliminary drafts, and an outline of the paper had to be submitted as supporting evidence. There were stories about this material being submitted in bushel baskets by the more ambitious students, although I never saw this done. The outline was supposed to have been written prior to the writing of the paper. I cheated. Not being skilled at writing outlines, I wrote the outline after I had written the paper. I justified this violation with the sophomoric, or was it Platonic, argument that I couldn't know what the outline of the paper would be until after it was written. Nonetheless, writing the outline after the paper is written is not a bad idea as a means of checking for coherence and intelligibility. If you can write a possible outline from your paper, then you are sure that it has an intelligible structure. If you find that you cannot do so, then something is wrong with its structure and you should fix it. The rhetoric of philosophical writing. Rhetoric is often described as the art of persuasion, since a person can be persuaded by bad reasons, bad reasoning, and insufficient, misleading, or false evidence. It has often been contrasted with philosophy, which is supposed to aim exclusively at truth and valid reasoning. Nonetheless, an aspect of philosophical writing that is essential to cogent argumentation, sound argumentation that the reader can recognize as being sound, is aptly termed rhetoric because it concerns how to construct the language that is supposed to get the reader to recognize a sound argument. Quite a bit has already been said about the rhetoric of philosophical writing in chapter 3. The structure of a philosophical essay. By stating one's thesis near the beginning of the paper, by then laying out the argument and raising and answering objections, the author has gone a long way to getting the reader to recognize a sound argumentation if it is sound. There are some other things to keep in mind in order to present your argument in the best way. Don't let a text dominate you. Many of your essays will give an exposition of some philosopher's argument. Often following the order in which the philosopher has presented the argument is the order in which you should present it. but not always. In a debate on free will between Thomas Hobbes and John Bramhall, Bramhall began by stating what kind of freedom, liberty he was not going to defend. Not liberty not to sin, not liberty from misery, and so on. Only later does he say something positive about what he means by liberty. If an author follows Bramhall's exposition, she might write this. Bramhall initially described his doctrine of liberty in negative terms. What he advocates is neither a liberty from sin, nor a liberty from misery, nor a liberty from servitude, nor a liberty from violence, a bit more informative in his denial that human actions are necessitated. I understand a liberty from necessity, or rather from necessitation, that is a universal immunity from all inevitability and determination to me. Bramhall is in effect saying that Hobbes is wrong. Later, Bramhall explains his view more clearly in positive terms by committing herself to liberty of election, where election is an act of judgment and understanding. The author at least implies that Bramhall's negative assertions are not as helpful as his positive assertions which come later, but the author reproduces Bramhall's unhelpful order. The author can improve on Bramhall's own statement of his position by beginning with the positive characterization and then adding the negative ones in order to give a complete exposition of what Bramhall wrote. Bramhall describes his doctrine of liberty as liberty of election, where election is an act of judgment and understanding. This liberty needs to be separated from what he calls a liberty from sin, a liberty from misery, a liberty from servitude, and a liberty from violence. A bit more informative is his denial that human actions are necessitated. I understand a liberty from necessity, or rather from necessitation, that is, a universal immunity from all inevitability and determination to one. Bramhall is in effect saying that Hobbes is wrong. He then goes on to commit himself to two concepts of liberty: a liberty to do this or that good, and a liberty to do and not do good and evil. Collect your thoughts. Collect your thoughts means that the sentences in a paragraph should follow a logical order. You need to take some additional time to figure out how they should be rearranged. If you repeat the same points in different paragraphs, you probably have not collected your thoughts. The following passage does not have its thoughts ordered correctly. Although Kant thought people did not have a right to revolt, he approved of the French Revolution. Revolution would upset the whole system of laws. Comment: the although clause talks about Kant's opposition to revolution, as does the second sentence which begins revolution, but the clause in between these two talks about his approval of the French Revolution. It interferes with the point of clause 1 and 3. Here is a coherent ordering of thoughts. Although Kant approved of the French Revolution, he thought people did not have a right to revolt. Revolution would upset the whole system of law. Comment: notice that Kant's approval of the French Revolution is an idea that is subordinate to the main point of the passage, namely that he opposed revolution in theory, and it is appropriately placed in the although clause, which is subordinate to Kant's belief that people do not have a right to rebel. Successive elaboration. One technique that my students have found very helpful for improving their writing is what I call successive elaboration. With this technique, you begin by stating in one sentence the thesis or main point of your essay. In trying to formulate that one sentence, you should not be concerned with what your audience might need as background information, and you need not be shy of using technical terms. The required background information and explanation of technical terms are to be supplied in the successive elaborations. For example, you might know that you want your essay to prove this: some human actions are free. Your next step is to build upon this one sentence, perhaps by supplying the premises that you think prove it. Some human actions are free, for humans are held responsible for some actions, and persons can be held responsible only for free actions. Now, this essay fragment should be elaborated, and it can be elaborated in a number of ways that are suggested by the essay itself. What is an action? What is it for an action to be free? What is responsibility? Not all of these questions need to be answered in the next elaboration, although they might be. Here's one possible elaboration. Some human actions are free, for humans are held responsible for some actions, and persons can be held responsible only for free actions. In order to understand this argument, several terms need to be explained or defined. By a free action, I mean an action that is not caused by any event other than an act of will. By being responsible for an action, I mean an action for which a person might be praised or blamed. And by an action, I mean any change in a body or mind. This elaboration suggests other questions and issues. Why is the issue of free will important? Why do some philosophers think that no actions are free? The elaboration of the essay fragment proceeds by trying to answer these questions either partially or wholly. Notice that the essay, as developed so far, begins abruptly. It does not yet have an introduction. Both the question, why is the issue of free will important, and the notion of responsibility in the central argument suggest an appropriate introduction. Although students often think that the introduction must be the first thing they write and the conclusion the last, it seems to me that the opposite is true more often than not. You cannot introduce a reader to where you want to take him unless you already have a clear idea of where you want to go. Now, read this elaboration. One of the most important issues for human beings is also one of the central issues in philosophy. It concerns freedom and responsibility. In this essay, I will argue that some human actions are free, for humans are held responsible for some actions, and persons can be held responsible only for free actions. In order to understand this argument, several terms need to be explained or defined. By free action, I mean an action that is not caused by any event other than an act of will. By being responsible for an action, I mean an action for which a person might be praised or blamed. And by action, I mean any change in a body or mind that is caused by a motion internal to it. The biggest obstacle to the view that some human actions are free is the belief in universal causation, that is, the view that every event is caused by some other event. In this example of successive elaboration, I have added text to both the front and the back of the essay fragment. Often sentences need to be inserted between the existing sentences and those sentences modified in order to accommodate the new text. The great advantages of this method of composing are order and control. The method is orderly because every addition is justified and invited by some particular portion of text. The method is controlled because at each stage of the elaboration, the author knows what has dictated the additional text. At each stage, the author knows what is earlier and hence more basic than other parts. A student might balk at the process of successive elaboration on the ground that it overcommits her at too early a stage of her writing. A student might protest, but what if I make a mistake? What if the proposition I formulate as my main thesis is wrong? What if I formulate bad arguments for my wrong thesis? And how could I know my thesis is wrong and my arguments bad unless I first have good arguments? My reply is that even if an author begins drafting an essay with a thesis that she later finds out is false, and even if she constructs arguments for it that she later determines to be spurious, she has lost little or nothing for in discovering that a thesis is false. She has indirectly discovered the truth, the negation of her original thesis. Further, she has discovered some arguments that might lead or have led other people to believe the false thesis, namely the very arguments the author had devised for her original thesis. These are not fruitless discoveries, for if nothing else, the author can recast the essay she originally intended to write in a very simple way. Suppose she originally intended her main thesis to be unicorns exist. Suppose her basic argument was such and such. But then she discovered that her reasoning was faulty for such and such reason. Then she might reformulate her essay in this way. It is possible that unicorns exist for such and such, however, this argument is not cogent for so and so. Often, what an author discovers in drafting is not merely that her original thesis was wrong, but that it was simplistic and needed some qualification or other restriction in order to make it true. For example, in her desire to refute determinism, a student might first formulate her thesis too strongly as all human actions are free and then thinking that breathing and digestion are human actions. She might weaken her thesis to some human actions are free. Here are some elaborate examples of successive elaboration. Three short essays about the proper way to interpretation. The Second Amendment of the US Constitution are given. These are followed by longer versions of each of the three essays. Study how each gets expanded. First interpretation, first version. Only arms used by the militia are constitutionally guaranteed. The proper interpretation of the Second Amendment to the US Constitution requires some historical information about it in order to understand it. In the 18th century, American colonists were worried about being dominated by a standing army, that is, a permanent professional army which could consist of mercenaries to a greater or lesser degree. In contrast to an army, a militia was an occasional force made up of non professional soldiers. The difference between an army and a militia is maintained in the United States between the army governed by the federal government and state militias, although state militias today are more professional than they were in the 18th century. This historical information makes sense of the preamble to the Second Amendment, a well regulated militia being necessary to the security of free state. It means that the citizens of states must have the right to form militias, and in the 18th century, this required citizens, more particularly males of a certain age. Ownership of all weapons is constitutionally guaranteed. In what follows, the expansions and revisions of the essays about deleted words and phrases are struck through, and additions are in boldface type. Conceptual note taking. The two techniques already discussed, outlining and successive elaboration, assume that the author has a fairly good grasp of the structure and direction of the essay before she begins writing. More often than not, this is not the case. One good way of finding your direction and structure is what I call conceptual note taking. It is a kind of uncensored writing and is similar to what some writing theorists call free writing and others brainstorming. There are two main purposes for conceptual note taking. First, it forestalls writer's block, which is often caused either by the fear that one has nothing to say or the fear that what one has to say is wrong. Students sometimes mistakenly transforms these causes for not writing into justifications for not writing. That is unfortunate. Conceptual note taking undercuts writer's block because it is a process by which nothing that is written counts as wrong. Indeed, whatever is written contributes in some way to whatever becomes the final product, even if what is written is discarded. Moreover, even the thought that the author has nothing to say counts as a legitimate thought to be expressed. Once the sentence, I have nothing to say about the problem of universals is written, and thus suggests itself, I don't even know what a universal is. And others, Professor Rebus argued in this way, Suppose a piece of paper called A is white and another piece of paper called B is also white, then they have something in common, whiteness, and it is not identical with A or B. So things are universals. Conceptual note taking objectifies your philosophical stream of consciousness, which remains mysterious, haunting, and impenetrable until it is externalized. The second purpose of conceptual note taking is to provide you with materials to be organized and evaluated in preparation for writing a good first draft. Typically, conceptual note taking does not yield a good draft, nor is it supposed to. Very often, when you wish you could begin to write, you have nothing more than some scattered thoughts on your essay topic. You may have some sentences or examples that you know should appear somewhere in the essay, even though these sentences do not state the central thesis, and your examples need to be put into the right context. What you need to do is to write down your first thoughts about the topic. The thoughts you have need not be precise and need not be complete. You may have only a word or phrase in mind that you will want to think further about and develop later. The thoughts also need not be in any particular order. At this stage, what is important is getting half formed thoughts out of your head and onto paper so that they can be observed objectively. It is better to write down the thought that you have, no matter how inchoate and incoherent, than to wait for these thoughts to coalesce. There will be plenty of time later to figure out where they go and how they might advance your argument. You might come to see that you want to hold just the opposite of what you write down initially. That does not present a problem, for those initial thoughts present either something to argue against or the basis for demonstrating and eliminating confusions. Others may have shared with you. Even if you decide to discard those initial thoughts, little or nothing has been lost. You might not have been able to write your brilliant essay if you had not traversed the path paved with your initial obscure thoughts. Since one of the principal purposes of this exercise is to objectify your thoughts so that they can be studied, elaborated, and rearranged, it is often helpful to use relatively small pieces of paper and to put down just one thought on each. You can use 3 to 5-inch filling cards, tablets. If you use a word processor, put in a new page command often. After you have completed your note taking, it is easy to rearrange these cards or pages into a more logical order. Ideas written down at relatively distant times are easily brought together when they exist on separate cards or pages. Research and composing. Many essays require some sort of research, some investigation of the secondary literature, that is, what other people have written about what you want to write about. The temptation is to do the research before you begin your own writing, and you may have been taught that this is the recommended procedure. I do not recommend this in most cases. Doing research keeps you from writing, and starting to write is typically the hardest thing to do. Delaying the start seems most attractive to people. Further research can inhibit your writing. If you fill your head or your note cards with what other people say, you may find that there seems to be no room for thinking of what you want to say. Put simply, first write down what you think about the topic. Write as much as you can without relying upon what other people have thought. Doing this will force you to think about the topic. Once you have exhausted your own thoughts, begin your research. If something you have written has been written before by someone else, footnote it. If something you have written has been written better, quote and footnote it. If something you have written has been written in more detail, adapt it to your essay and footnote it. If someone has said something else and is wrong, you use his view as an objection to yours. Footnote and refute it. In short, don't delay. Write first, footnote later. There's one more case of research impinging on your writing to consider. If someone else has written the opposite of what you have written and is right, then use it to your advantage. For example, suppose you wrote such, and some scholars say Professor Wisdom has shown this to be false, then your draft can be adapted to fit this pattern. One might think that such and such, but as Professor Wisdom has shown, such and such is incorrect. For since you yourself formulated such and such, it probably has some initial possibility, or at least is not intentionally a straw man argument. Profit from your mistakes. If your writing has become bogged down and you are not able to make any progress, research can sometimes get you writing again. When you run out of ideas or do not know how to go on from some point, read or browse through some books relevant to your topic. Some item in them may stimulate your thinking and hence your writing. It is quite likely that you will need some sort of footnote to acknowledge the help you received from the big book if you borrow something substantive from it. For more about footnotes and research, see Appendix C Scholarship, Notes, Citations, and References. Sentences and paragraphs. Every well crafted sentence and paragraph has a structure that effectively conveys the idea in it. Let's begin with sentences. Some contain too many ideas and some not enough. Students often begin an essay that does little or no work. Descartes was a great philosopher, and the problem of free will has challenged the greatest minds of philosophers for centuries, even for 10 of centuries. Your professor will know that Descartes was a great philosopher and that the problem of free will has been around a long time. Sentences often contain too many ideas. There are two general reasons for this. One is that you want to guard against the professor's thinking that you will not discuss some topic or that you are not aware that the main idea of your sentence involves some problem that needs to be discussed. What you need to understand is that all the relevant issues need to be introduced and dealt with in a slow and orderly way. The other reason for putting too many ideas in one sentence is that it makes it easy to write a syntactically complex sentence, and you hope that the complexity will be taken for profundity. I believe it was from John Searle that I first heard the adage, whatever can be thought clearly can be said clearly. Another common problem in paragraphs is the occurrence of sentences that do not advance the argument. They needlessly repeat information that has already been provided, often in the immediately preceding sentence. Here is an example. The solution to the problem of negative existentialism is, I think, extremely simple. If one thinks about the language out of which the problem arises, the solution is not difficult to see. One way to see this that sentence does not advance the essays to compare its main clause. The solution is not difficult to see with the main clause of one. The solution is extremely simple. They say almost the same thing. What sentence 2 contributes is the idea and the subordinate clause. If one thinks thus the essay can be given more momentum by including the subordinate clause of 2 with the main clause of 1. The solution to the problem of negative existentials is, I think, extremely simple. If one thinks about the language out of which the problem arises. Sentences that do not sufficiently advance the argument of the essay are usually the result of drafting, because the author is not quite sure what she wants to say or how to say it. The same thought is written down more than once in slightly different terms. It is probably a mistake to try to avoid these kinds of repetitions because it will probably inhibit the free thinking needed to get the essay right. The solution is to write down what you think is needed at the time of drafting and then eliminate what is repetitious when you are revising the essay. Example 1. The objectionable sentences in the two examples above are not doing their fair share of the work in moving the essay forward. Notice that the sentences that were problems followed sentences that were clear enough on their own. Sometimes a sentence is unavoidably ambiguous or subject to misunderstanding, possibly because it expresses a difficult idea or involves a technical term. In such cases, the sentence may need to be followed by a sentence or clause that says just about the same thing in order to disambiguate or otherwise clarify it. Example. Miss Grundy, your 7th grade teacher, no doubt told you that every paragraph has to have a topic sentence. She was right. Each paragraph is like a mini essay. It contains some main theme and it should be easy for the reader to find that theme. That means in part that the main theme should be expressed in the main clause of a sentence. not a subordinate clause unless there is some good overriding reason to do that. One reason many paragraphs lack unity is that the student keeps shifting her focus. Focus often shifts when the student is not clear about the focus of the entire essay. Polishing. At some stage, your essay has an introduction, a fully worked out middle, and a conclusion. Before typing your essay in its final version, you need to polish it. There are stylistic burrs that need to be sanded and grammatical gouges that need to be patched before it is presentable. Concerning grammar, I will say only that I strongly recommend it. There are many books and websites that you can consult for help with grammar. Concerning stylistic adjustments, they are best reserved for the final draft. Although there is nothing wrong with making obvious improvements in style as your composition progresses, you should go through your penultimate draft with just stylistic modifications in mind. There are all sorts of simple adjustments that can be made to improve your essay. Try to find an active, vigorous verb to replace a phrase consisting of some form of to be and a noun phrase, especially an abstract noun. My argument will be I will argue that change passive constructions into active one. The existence of universals was proven by Plato. Plato proved the existence of universals. Transform prepositional phrases with abstract nouns into clauses. The reconstruction of Kant's argument is difficult. Reconstructing Kant's argument is difficult. Use participle phrases to subordinate a thought expressed in a main clause. Aristotle tried to devise a more naturalistic theory of universals. He came up with his theory of immanent universals. In trying to devise a more naturalistic theory of universals, Aristotle came up with his theory of immanent universals. Avoid needless or uninformative qualification. Plato's position is not really contradictory. Plato's position is not contradictory. Eliminate needlessly complex phrases. Russell makes use of this construction. Russell uses this construction. Quine gives vent to his belief that Quine believes make the antecedent of pronouns clear. Consider this fragment. Aristotle struggled long and hard to devise a more naturalistic view of Plato's theory of universal. This is the topic of this essay. What is the topic? Is it Plato's theory, Aristotle's view, or Aristotle's struggle to devise a view? If we assume that it is the latter, then a suggested reason Aristotle struggled long and hard to devise a more naturalistic view of Plato's theory of universe. So the struggle is the topic of this essay. Replace a phrase with a synonym. The word substance has two meanings. The word substance is ambiguous. Be sure your sentences literally say what you want them to say. Sometimes authors do not connect the right verb with the right subject. This sentence about a person in Hobbes' state of nature, according to Hobbes, people fear the state of nature will kill them. Should have been, according to Hobbes, people fear that they will die if they stay in the state of nature. The italics indicate what was left out. Notice that the grammatical object of fear is no longer a noun phrase but a that clause. The state of nature does not kill anyone, but conditions in the state of nature will. Often the problem is caused by the author's desire to be concise. The sentence, the sovereign is the only way to survive, the state of nature needs to be expanded to being protected by a sovereign is the only way to escape the dangers of the state of nature. The italics indicate added words. Notice that when the sentence is filled out, the word survive gets replaced by the phrase escape. The dangers. Simple and direct. A sentence can sometimes be turned around yield to yield a simpler, more direct one. Change. There exists no need for rebellion on the people's part because the people do not need to rebel because be wary of sentences that begin with there is. Odd phrases looped writing. Why would an author write Locke's view is ludicrous to the point of being laughable? My guess is that the author thought that Locke's view was highly impossible but wanted to say it more colorfully. The author could not choose between ludicrous and laughable and so used both when one would have been sufficient. The phrase ludicrous to the point of being laughable is acceptable in a draft of an essay. You want to get your thoughts down without unnecessary hesitation, but in the final copy, at least one phrase should have been deleted. However, it is better to avoid words like ludicrous or laughable because they are insulting. It is better to say that a view is highly implausible and explain why. Other phrases, such as Locke's blatant disregard for, should also be avoided and replaced with something like Locke does not consider. These are only some examples of the kind of stylistic improvements you might make in a penultimate draft. Different people are subject to different stylistic bursts. When a friend or teacher marks infelicious phrases in construction, try to figure out whether this sort of infelicity regularly appears in your prose. If it does, keep on the lookout for it. Different people prefer different techniques for eliminating stylistic blurs. These techniques, to some extent, determine the person's style. Evolution of an essay. Printed below are three versions of a short essay. Because I have been emphasizing argumentation so much in this book, I have decided to make the following examples versions of an interpretive essay which has its as its goal not the presentation of a cogent deductive argument but an interpretation or explication of some very brief but important passages in a work by Immanuel Kant. Version A is a good draft of a short essay. It should not be considered a first draft but the result of outlining, exercise, elaboration, or conceptual note taking and revision. Since only the author herself could appreciate the genuine fits and starts of her essay, version A is a relatively cleaned up version. Only one false start is retained in order to preserve some flavor of authenticity. Version B is the same rough draft with some substantive but most stylistic modification handwritten in. Version C is the final version, the result of incorporating the modifications indicated in version B. A good exercise for you would be to make your own corrections on version A and compare them with the corrections on B. You should expect the corrections to be very different from each other because there is an infinite number of ways to modify an essay. You should think about why certain changes were made in the following drafts. Many of them are instructive and instantiate advice given earlier in the book. Ideally, these changes should be discussed with your professor or among several students. Some of the changes that were made are controversial. You or your professor might disagree with them. If you do, it is important to explain why and to suggest alternatives. The final version of the essay might be further improved. How? A rough draft.